Hi everyone. So in Module 10, we are going to talk about the East Asian realm. For your textbook for this module, look at Chapter 9. It starts on page 370, and I'd really like you to focus on the material from page 372 to 385. So that'll give you kind of the core basic material for this realm. And this is figure 9.1 from your book, and this shows how the textbook defines the East Asian realm. So we have the countries of China, Japan, South Korea and North Korea, Mongolia, and Taiwan, which I'm going to circle for you. Taiwan is this island here. And of course, Korea is over here. Mongolia is here. And just to provide you with a little bit of context, when I talked about the Altai during the Russian realm module, the Altai is right here. So that's where I was doing my master's research, and Kazakhstan, which is part of the Central Asian and former Soviet realm, is here. So just to kind of orient you a little bit. And of course, we're going to do one of the drag and drop puzzles on this realm, but not until the next module, but it will include the countries in this realm. Okay, so this realm is really fascinating in terms of climate and the way climate determines population, and I think it's maybe even more obvious in this realm than some of the others have been. So it's something I like to talk about in quite a bit of detail because I find it really interesting. Of course, the humid temperate climates, the green ones down here, are those climates that tend to be the best for agriculture. And if you recall, that's because they have their soils are relatively well developed, and they tend to have a longer growing season. So you think about what you need for agriculture. You need good soils, you need adequate moisture, and you need an adequate growing season where the temperatures are above freezing. So humid equatorial climates, you have that long growing season, pretty much year-round growing season, and you probably have adequate moisture in a lot of places, not everywhere, but a lot of places, but you really don't have good soils because they never have a chance to go dormant to kind of regenerate and revitalize themselves. So they're just constantly cycling nutrients and growth around the tropics. And so there really aren't a lot of nutrients tied up in the soil, so it's not good for agriculture. Your desert climates, you usually don't have very good soils, and you don't have adequate moisture. And then the humid cold climates, the blues and the purples, you might have adequate moisture, and you actually have really good soils in these areas typically, but you don't have the long growing season. So the humid temperate climate, the green climates, are kind of your sweet spot where you likely have adequate moisture, you have good soils, and you have an adequate growing season. So when we look around the world, we find the most productive agricultural areas in these green climate zones. So in the United States, it encompasses the southeastern United States and kind of the Midwest breadbasket region. In East Asia, the humid temperate climates are really isolated to this eastern zone over here. We also have some in southern Japan and South Korea. So as we go through this module, we're going to talk about this bit in South Korea in a little bit, but before that, we're going to talk about this configuration that we see on kind of the mainland China and Mongolia area. So just keep in mind where these humid temperate climates are geographically, and then also take a look at these desert climates further north here and where they occur. So here's Mongolia. Here's the line that shows where Mongolia is present day. And these yellow desert climates or dry climates tend to be semi-arid steppes, so they're actually kind of a grassland, but adapted to these kind of higher altitudes and dry climates. So you can kind of think western Kansas. It's a little bit similar to western Kansas. All right, so these climates are going to tell a story, so keep those in mind. Okay, so this is the population distribution of East Asia, and this is the first story that those climates tell, because if you think about where those humid temperate climates are and the agricultural most productive agricultural areas, the most dense population in this realm really coincides with those climates and those areas. As you get out west into the higher elevations and north in the desert areas, the population becomes much more scarce. So the climate is really heavily driving the distribution of the population in this realm. And we're going to talk about the Sichuan Basin, but just to show you on this map, the Sichuan Basin is a very highly productive agricultural area that has been inhabited for many thousands of years, and today is one of the most densely populated areas in East Asia. Okay, so the population of China today is nearing 1.4 billion people. And the picture here is a screen grab from Google. A lot of times if you just Google China population or US population, it'll give you an infographic like this that compares it to a couple of other countries. And you can pull this slider bar along it to see how they grew over time. So when I Googled China population, it gave me China, India, and the United States. So you can see China's growth has been on a rapid upward trajectory. India's has as well. And the United States, even though our population is growing, has not been as rapid as China and India. But I also think this is interesting because it shows that India's growth is nearing China's, or India's population number is nearing China's very rapidly. So China's growth seems to almost be leveling off a little bit, whereas India's growth is booming. So India may surpass China in the near future. Okay, so like we talked about on the last slide, the overwhelming majority of China's population is located in the eastern 1/3 of the country, and that is because of that climate, the influence of climate, and also the influence of climate on China's history. So just under half of the population today is rural. That's another one of those areas that is rapidly urbanizing. It's the most densely settled population cluster in the world, and we really see the population distribution heavily influenced by these geographic factors such as climate, soil fertility, water supply, and elevation. Okay, China has a number of great rivers, but the 4 major ones that have influenced China's geography and history are these 4, and just a disclaimer, this is the one realm that I have less direct experience with. And so I readily admit that my pronunciations are probably awful in terms of, um, being able to pronounce things accurately. So I try to look them up, but disclaimer, I might mispronounce things horribly. So um, the Huanghe, or the Yellow River, is here, this long one. The Yangtze River is this long one here. And you may have heard of the Yangtze River before, if you've heard about the Three Gorges Dam or the Yangtze River Dam. This was a major dam project on the Yangtze River that flooded quite a bit of historically relevant land, and land that many people relied on and had ancestral ties to. And so it was a hugely controversial project, but the Chinese government justified it, saying that they needed the water supply for their growing population. And they did put in a provision that allows fishermen, because there were a number of people who historically rely on this river and go up and down it in boats. And so they built these great locks on this dam to allow barge traffic to go through. And they put in a provision saying that local fishermen and boaters could go through the locks for free. So that was one effort to try to make it a little more palatable to the local community. But that was a hugely controversial project, but it is done now. And there is a documentary, if you're interested, called Up the Yangtze, that travels up that river before the dam is closed, to kind of document what it looked like before the dam was in place. So that's another major river. The Pearl River here in the south, and then the Liao River in the north are kind of the four major ones. And what I want you guys to notice in terms of geography is that all of these rivers, with the exception of the Liao, have their headwaters in the Himalayas, or the Tibetan Plateau, which is here. Not only do the major rivers of East Asia have their headwaters in this area of the Tibetan Plateau, so do the great rivers of South Asia. So if you remember, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and then the major rivers of Southeast Asia, which we'll talk about in the next module. All of these rivers spring from the Himalayas, and specifically from the area of Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau, and rely very heavily on glacial meltwater and snow melt to feed them in the spring. There's a spring freshening that happens when the snow and the glaciers that have built up over the winter begin to melt with the warmer weather. So all of these rivers are crucial to the survival of the populations of this region of the world, and all of these rivers are also affected by climate change. Okay, so I've already kind of drawn that connection between the climate, population, and agricultural area, but here are the two maps side by side. So you can see that direct connection between the climate and population distribution. This also shows the Sichuan Basin, which I mentioned before, very densely settled population cluster. And the reason that the soils are so good in this region and have supported so many people for so many thousands of years is because of this rich alluvium that's carried by the rivers and the running water down from the Tibetan Plateau. So alluvium is, you can think of it as just soil that is moved by water. So when you're in the floodplain of a river, soil that has been deposited in that floodplain is alluvium. There's another term, colluvium, and that's soil that has been deposited by gravity. So soil maybe that was eroded off of a mountain or has been deposited somewhere by a landslide, but it's been moved where it is by gravity. Alluvium is soil that has been moved to where it is by water. And so as soils are eroded from the Himalayas and carried down to this basin, the soils are continuously regenerated by this alluvium that is carried down from the mountains. So this idea of alluvium is why floodplains are considered such good farmland. And if you are here in Kansas, you might notice that especially in northeast Kansas, almost all of our agriculture is in low-lying floodplain areas. So if you look at a map of the Kansas River, or if you drive down highway, oh gosh, is it 56, I think, out of Manhattan? Or no, maybe it's Highway 40. Anyway, that highway that kind of parallels I-70. Sorry, I can't remember the number right now. But that highway that goes right through the floodplain of the Kansas River, that's all agriculture. And the reason for that is that the floodplains of rivers tend to be the most fertile soils for agriculture. They're the most fertile because that river would flood occasionally and regenerate them and deposit organic material. I mean, you think about the amount of organic material that is carried by rivers and streams, leaves, debris, dead fish, all of this kind of icky stuff we might think of as icky, but is actually very important to the system. And when rivers flood, all of that stuff gets deposited into the soil on the floodplain. And so it makes these floodplains these really rich areas that are great for agriculture. Unfortunately, because we have become so efficient at controlling rivers, most rivers, especially in the United States, very rarely flood anymore. And that's not to say that they don't. We just had some major floods on the Missouri River. But with the infrastructure that we've put in, dams, levees, those types of things, we certainly don't get annual floods the way that we did historically. And so the farmland and floodplains relies more and more on fertilizers to regenerate those soils, whereas before that regeneration or that fertilization was accomplished by flooding. So just kind of a tangent I just went off on there, but it's interesting to see how these rivers affect human culture and have affected human history. Okay, so this to me is one of the most interesting ways that climate has affected the geography of East Asia. So this map shows ethno-linguistic areas. In other words, each one of these different colors is a different ethnic group and a different linguistic group in East Asia. So just take a minute to look at this. We have the Han, which is the largest ethnic group in China. We have a number of smaller ethnic groups in a relatively small area here in eastern China. And then we have the Mongols in purple, up here. And then we get into the Turkic ethnic groups over here in the west, and this is one place where the political boundaries really don't make sense because those Turkic ethnic groups extend all the way into Pakistan, like all the way over here, up through Kazakhstan and into Siberia, in even north of here. So the political boundaries there, this is another place on the globe that they don't make a whole lot of sense. And you might notice the Tajik ethnic group here. Well, here's Tajikistan right next door, so the Tajik state, but the ethnic group doesn't follow the political boundaries, and we've talked about why that is, because these boundaries were typically drawn by entities other than the ethnic groups themselves, and they tend not to make a lot of sense. So that's a story we see all over the world. The Tibetan ethnic group, we're going to talk a little bit about Tibet, but they occupy the Tibetan Plateau, also known as the source of the major rivers. You can kind of see where these rivers begin. So that's the Tibetan Plateau, which today is part of China. Okay. And then we have the Japanese ethnic group, of course, on the Japanese islands, and the Korean ethnic group on the Korean peninsula. So we'll talk about Japan and Korea both. But right now, what I want you guys to notice on this map is a couple of things. So if you think about the climate map, the humid temperate climates that are good for agriculture are generally in this area, right? So when you look at these smaller ethnic groups in these relatively small areas, that is a direct impact of the climate and the fact that the agricultural climates are in this region. So think about why that is. If you have the ability to have productive agriculture, then historically, you might live a more settled life. You probably are going to live a more settled life because you don't have to go out looking for food. You can grow food right where you are. And so you might not need as large of an area to support your culture or your population. You don't need to roam, in other words. In comparison to that, if you are in a dry climate where agriculture really isn't as much of an option, like, say, the Mongolians, then you are probably going to be more of a nomadic culture. In other words, you are going to follow herds of animals. You're going to have to be very mobile and travel very far in order to find food and water and resources. So that's exactly what we see in the reflection of culture on climate. We have the Mongolian ethnic group who were very nomadic over history and still are very nomadic in many places. And then we have the people of Southeast China who were very agricultural and tended to have smaller, less mobile areas or cultures because they didn't need to be. They had all of the resources that they needed where they were, so they didn't have to spread out as much. So that's one place where we see the impact of climate. The other place that I find really neat is in the reflection of history and sort of military strategies over the centuries. So we're going to talk in the next module about the Great Wall of China. But the Great Wall of China was built almost exactly along this demarcation between the dry climate of Mongolia and the more humid temperate climates of southeastern China. And the reason the Great Wall was built was to protect Chinese cultures here further south, to protect China from invading nomadic tribes, primarily the Mongolians, although there were others. And so the reason the Mongolians would have been trying to invade China is also a reflection of this difference in climates. So the Mongolians were notoriously always trying to expand their territory, but they needed to because they needed more resources. There weren't a lot of resources in this dry steppe, so they needed greater area in order to ensure that they had the resources that they need. And so when you look over history, the times that the Mongolians tried to invade southern China typically coincided with times of drought or other resource scarcity. So basically, when the Mongolians were experiencing hardships and they needed better resources, that's when they would try to invade to the south and capture some of these good agricultural resources further south. So that Great Wall of China was built just almost exactly along the division between the dry climate and the humid temperate climate, as a reflection of the difference in resources and the difference in the cultures. So I find that really fascinating. I hope you do too. And we will talk about that a little bit more in the next module.